Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am putting this episode up a day or so early for a couple of reasons. Primarily, I've got some heavy-duty work responsibilities Monday and Tuesday. But also because today's got some podcast resonance. I'm recording this on March 7th, 2021, which makes it 1 year to the day since the last time I recorded in person with anybody. That day is pretty sharp in my memory. I am writing up a longer piece about that for the weekly email, which I also hope to get out today. The short version is I drove to Brooklyn to record with Whitney Matheson, drove to Midtown Manhattan to go to the Antiquarian Book Fair, where I caught up with past guest Henry Wessels and bumped into another past guest in Ed Mendelsohn, and then drove to Washington Heights to record with Sato Muhalayan. And a few days later, the world went into America went into lockdown. New York and New Jersey went into super lockdown, and I've never recorded with another person again. In person, I mean. I've done this remote thing, and I've talked a lot in the past year about how I miss the in-person conversations. You know, even though the remote setup has allowed me to record with people I'd likely never get the opportunity to meet up with. And, you know, I've also said once I get back to in-person again, I'll probably still do remote ones too, but it's been a year, man. The remote versus in-person thing, by the way, is echoed in my day job, which some of you may know. I'm a lobbyist for a weird part of the pharmaceutical industry. Basically, my guys are the guys who are making the vaccines and all that for Moderna and companies like that. So, you're welcome. But the discussion I'm having with FDA is, see, because of the pandemic, they haven't been able to send inspectors out to inspect facilities until recently. Now they're starting to get some ability to do that as infection rates go down in different areas, but it's only on a limited basis. So they've had to use remote technologies and other ways of getting data that they would have put together through an in-person inspection. But that only works in some cases. Like some of the facilities, they just can't judge one way or the other without being there. So they've had to tell drug applicants, sorry, you know, you're not going to get a final assessment and approval for this because we can't come to the facilities. It's a really complicated regulatory process that I'm not going to go into here, but the fact that I know it is part of what keeps me gainfully employed. The upshot is, the FDA has had to make a lot of changes in a short period of time. And, you know, on the industry side, we're hoping they'll maintain some of those changes, even when it's safe to travel again, so that the pendulum doesn't swing from like 100% in person to 100% remote to 100% in person again, but instead comes to rest, you know, somewhere in between. But I'm rambling, as is my thing. My point is, everything changed in the past year for all of us, but, you know, we can build on some of what we learned during that time. My other point is, and it came up during the conversation with John Porcellino a few weeks ago, but it's also a song title by Rush. I'm an analog kid. As much as I use digital technology to produce and distribute and tell people about this show, this is still about human voices and human interaction. And it's great to, you know, be able to get part of that, you know, remotely. But I really hope, you know, we can bring the in-person connection back sometime this year. As does this week's guest. How's that for a segue? This time around, I am talking with Jen Silverman, who has a brand new novel out called We Play Ourselves from Random House. I loved this book, and I hope you check it out. Okay, it's going to be more plot than anything else, but I'll fill you in. We Play Ourselves it tells the story of a promising but not young enough playwright named Cass. And as the novel begins, Cass is running away from New York because of a scandal/internet humiliation that she won't quite tell us about. It's a first-person present narrative, but it somehow involves her big theater debut. She's a writer again, not a performer. So as we begin, she's running to a friend in L.A. and soon finds herself working on an insane film project involving high school girls creating a feminist fight club with a director who is treating it like documentary and verite, but seems to be bending or breaking the rules a little bit, and then a lot. And basically there was a point in that section of the novel when I thought, this movie sounds like a cross between Fight Club, Synecdoche, New York, and Bowfinger, but, you know, in a good way. Those are films that I really enjoy generally. Fight Club, not so much, but, you know, you get me. But anyway, all the while, Cass is in L.A. She is trying to test the waters back in New York through her agent, but she can only reach the receptionist who refuses to put her calls through. But she ends up becoming pals in desperation with the receptionist. And bit by bit, we learn what led to Cass's flight from the city and why there's likely no coming back. I should point out, this is a comedic novel. If the premises so far don't tip that off, you may have a very different sense of humor than I do. But anyway, that's all plot. And there's plenty there. There's plenty of story. But Jen does so much more than that in this book. The theater scenes in New York really capture like the alchemy and intensity that takes place when a play is coming together and all the pressures that are involved in that. And the LA section, to me, really evokes the heightened unreality, I think is a term I used, of that city, and the sneaking suspicion that every moment is a spectacle for someone. There's also a third location for the novel that I won't talk about lest I give anything away, but also very, very much captures the milieu that it's after. And through it all, we learn more, not just about Cass and her bad decisions and her self-deprecating look at the world, but the whole world of the arts she lives in and the opportunities that exist and don't exist for women creators, and the economic pressures that cause all manner of compromises and the desire for fame or just recognition, and how quickly that can turn poisonous. I'll tell you, We Play Ourselves is masterfully written in terms of story construction, voice, tone, and it still felt kind of important to me as a sign of where we are in America as a culture. And as I said, I also laughed very hard at several points. So to get back to that seg, which probably defeats the purpose of a seg if it takes you 5 minutes to get back to it, Jen Silverman is an accomplished playwright, and there are some similarities between her bio and Cass's, but don't draw a direct one-to-one connection. She warns us of that pretty easily, or pretty well. What really comes across in our conversation when we talk about life over the past year is that there's no substitute for the communal experience of theater. And the shutdown of theater, you know, it's been devastating for performers and writers and directors and all the people who work behind the scenes and are involved in producing theater. But it's also, I don't want to say devastating, but there's also a loss for audiences who may not even know the experiences that they're missing. There's this year of absence where we don't even know what could have been and what sort of communal experiences we could have shared or what we could have been open to. Instead, well, to go back a year, we'd all be watching Tiger King on Netflix. You know, there's been 10 million things since then, but that was the first communal experience at home, I guess, we had during lockdown. Anyway, all of this means I was glad to talk to Jen, of all people, for this weird anniversary episode when we're all at this moment of COVID anniversaries. And we're all thinking of, you know, where were you when you realized this was real? And when was the last time you did X, Y, or Z? And what was the thing you were looking forward to doing last spring or summer, but, you know, etc. So We Play Ourselves was written pre-pandemic, but it speaks an awful lot to where we are now. and hoping for that moment when we can have the communal experience again. Now, here's Jen's bio. Jen Silverman is a New York-based writer and playwright. She is the author of the story collection The Island Dwellers, which was longlisted for a Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for debut fiction. Her plays have been produced across the United States and internationally, and she also writes for television and film. She is a 2-time MacDowell Colony Fellow, a member of New Dramatists, and the recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts grant, a Lower Manhattan Cultural Council Fellowship, the Yale Drama Series Award, and a Playwrights of New York Fellowship. Her new novel is We Play Ourselves. She also draws sad pandas and posts them on Instagram as This Panda Is Sad. I tell you that because of a comment I make pretty late in the episode. Like Chekhov's gun, which is about as much as I know about theater, I should plant that seed now so it comes to fruition about an hour or so from now. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Jen Silverman. In the very scant research I did, and I'll explain why it was so scant while we're talking later, you had a traveling childhood. Your career, as a playwright and then a writer overall, takes you a lot of places. What's home for you?
I mean, I think I've been really lucky to have a lot of homes at this point.
Yeah.
New York has definitely become a major home for me because now it's been so many years since I've been here. But Paris will always be a bit of a home just because I spent so many formative years there and went back so often to the same neighborhood. And, there are many different homes sort of scattered.
Yeah, it's what I sort of wonder whether you're a hermit crab or, whether there's a fixed place that always kind of resonates as, this is where Jen feels at home. Or is that the theater or just writing overall, I guess, for you?
Yeah, writing is really like a sort of a touchstone that I come back to. It's funny, my partner is a hermit crab. Like he believes in a home and we both travel a lot for work. He's a scenic designer for theater. But every time we go to a new city, particularly to do work, it would take me left on my own, possibly months to unpack, and I might not even unpack. And within hours, he has things put away and he's making a place that feels like a sanctuary. And so I have seen up close what it is like to be really motivated by home.
Yeah, I've lived in the same house almost 50 years. So that's one of those things that,
oh, wow.
Is very, yeah, see? People generally have that reaction. I wasn't going to characterize it, but oh wow is kind of the thing. I'm recording this sitting in what was formerly the rec room in my childhood, which has now been converted into a library and office for me, which I didn't realize was actually the one thing I really wanted in life. But as it turns out, being surrounded by all my books in the place where I grew up is kind of a thing. But
that's kind of beautiful.
But anyway,
can I ask what city you're in?
Oh, it's a town. I'm 25 miles from New York City in a town called Ringwood, New Jersey, from which you can see New York City's entire skyline as you leave town. And for 1 year now, I have been looking at every time I have to leave town for something. I think there's New York. Don't know when I'll be back, but I really, really want to go there. And sure would be nice. But yeah. So yeah, it's a weird little wooded, just beyond suburban thing. Like there are times where I'll be doing this. There's a window right behind the monitor where I'm sitting, and a stampede of deer will just go rolling by, and that's life, close to the city, but not too close.
Right. It's a good distance. When the deer show up, it's a good distance.
Yeah. When the bears show up, it's a little more questionable.
Sure. But hopefully they're still hibernating.
Yeah, there are times where, well, I'll send you a picture of what it was like when just having bear go wandering through my front yard, eating the neighbor's trash, and my not realizing they were out there when I went. So anyway, but we're getting far afield from you and your novel. The thing that I wondered about, and you address it sort of in a essay in LitHub recently, but the solo process of novel writing. in comparison to like I know you're writing by yourself with theater, but it becomes a collaborative process. And the writing you do with TV and film, it's a writer's room, and therefore, is built on collaboration. What was solo novel writing like? Or what did you have to learn or unlearn from the other writing experiences and expertise that you have?
Yeah. There's some things about it were completely new. And it took me a while to find my footing. I mean, what didn't feel new to me was the process of having to sit down and figure out, in a very sort of solitary way, what it was that I was doing. Because even though, I mean, I've obviously been embedded in the theater for a long time and writing plays for many years, each play is a new interrogation. And in my process in particular, for me, form and content and the way that they talk to each other is very important, so that each play sort of by necessity needs to take on a different form than perhaps the last play or the next play. And so I've spent a lot of time, and I'm comfortable spending a lot of time, by myself in a really sort of solitary mind frame trying to figure out what I'm doing. But then the part where novel writing became entirely new for me is in theater. What I'm doing, it sort of always revolves around the question of what is the invitation that I'm extending to my audience? How am I inviting them into this space, inviting them into the fact of participating in a live gathering? What am I asking them to bear witness to that can only happen in a theater, as opposed to like, well, you could have stayed home, you could have watched it on, streaming channel, whatever,
Yeah.
What is the thing that makes us uniquely theater? And of course, a novel is not theater. And so I spent, I'm sure it wasn't as long as it felt, but it felt like several lifetimes being like, what is a novel? And particularly, I mean, I read a lot of novels, like particularly when theater was open, I tended to read more fiction than I did plays because I would just go to the theater. But all of a sudden, when I was trying to write one, I was like, how do I even know what a novel is? And eventually, what the sort of the breakthrough moment, I suppose, or series of moments, came in realizing that perhaps for me, with this particular book, writing this novel was somewhat like writing an extended monologue, and that the narrator is, I mean, we're first person, present tense. The narrator is speaking to an audience of sorts. Or she's speaking to herself, but there's a way in which there's a kind of intimate and a direct address that's occurring. And when I could plug in through that angle, then I started to be able to discover what else a novel was, for me at that time. But I needed, in some ways, I needed the tools of theater to help me locate myself in it.
Yeah, how does that? Well, it raises the question, I guess, or for me at least, how does writing that monologue differ from what you would be writing for actors, given, you're or even for TV, where you're writing for the strengths of an actor or the limitations of theater versus, you have a funny bit about a writer who, her play involves her suddenly getting up out of the audience, and I won't give anything else away about it because it made me laugh a lot. But basically taking over her own play with this extended monologue. We know why that doesn't happen. And what does it mean, I guess? How does it differ for you in terms of writing something that's, like you say, almost a 300-page monologue, but a 300-page telling, as opposed to writing things that are, again, limited by the nature of theater?
Yeah, well, what, in a way, and this is maybe a roundabout way of answering your question, so you can make me get more specific if this isn't. But when I think about sort of what stories belong in what media, in part what I'm thinking about is what kind of engagement with intimacy does the story require, right?
Yeah.
Because for TV, for example, you get a real intimacy from the durational quality of, like, you could spend, 8 to 72 episodes with a particular set of characters. Like, there is a real long haul intimacy there. Whereas with a film, there's a real visual intimacy, like you can track the slight flickering of the expression on somebody's face that can say as much as a monologue in certain circumstances. And with theater, there's the intimacy, of course, of gathering, like your body among other bodies. You are witnessing an unmediated performance. There's nothing between you and the performers. The performers are speaking directly to you in a way. And then with a book, the intimacy, of course, is the deep dive inside somebody else's mind. Like you are replicating the pattern of their thoughts with your thoughts as you read. So once the monologue quality of Cass's voice, of the narrator's voice, sort of located me in the kind of book I was writing, I could let go, I think, of needing to think through the lens of a theatrical construct, because the tools of book writing were so strong and so useful, in terms of really being able to penetrate someone's thoughts and live inside someone's thoughts. And we're sort of, I think we become very aware of places where Cass is telling us one thing, but it's not what she actually feels. And she's trying to tell herself a story along with telling us a story. And they're just sort of certain ways in which the tools of book writing really were able, to sort of kick in and take me deeper, I mean, if I had been writing that story for theater or for an actor, for a monologue, I think I actually would have ended up writing it quite differently.
Yeah. And it's, I should have grounded it with that word story, because it's, in addition to, and I don't want to make it sound too dry or too academic an exercise as we're like dissecting the whole nature of voice and everything. The story itself is ridiculously entertaining, and the way it's told and the way what you parcel out and how you do it never comes off as arbitrary or, I'm doing this just to tease the reader, but you craft it very well in a way that it shows an understanding of story regardless of the medium, I suppose. So there. but do you feel like someone who has attended or been in the audience for some of your plays would recognize We Play Ourselves as, oh, that's Jen? That's Jen's voice, not you or Cass, but that, this is a Jen project?
I am told so. I've actually, a lot of theater people have reached out to me after they read the book, and sort of, said that it was very much that they hadn't known what to expect, but it was sort of very much what they might have expected from my voice. So I suppose.
There are things to take as a compliment. I would take that one well, as opposed to, when people would read my stuff and say, oh, that's just like talking to you. I'm like, you mean I never shut up and it's just my side? Okay, well, I guess you're right. Now, one of the things that really that struck me within the book was the fact that Cass is ultimately an absurdist playwright, and yet she's telling the story in a realist mode. Talk about that, or at least the lack of a surreal flight by any means, or any absurdism beyond the absurdism of our day-to-day lives. Yeah,
well, what can I say about it? I mean, in general, I'm really, and this, to anyone who knows my theater work, this comes as no surprise, but I am really interested in what absurdist theater can do. The ways in which, to me, it actually feels like often a very accurate reflection of reality. That absurdist theater is a very particular tool for thinking about power dynamics, thinking about politics in a society, thinking about sort of human relations inside communities, that there's a way in which I'm really interested in art forms that kind of reflect us back to ourselves in unexpected ways, so that we're not armored against that reflection, but we sort of can perceive ourselves in a different way and perhaps more accurately. So I was interested in locating Cass sort of in that particular practice. I also, American theater, obviously there are many kinds of American theater, but for a long time, the industry of American theater has really been motivated by realism. Theaters have been convinced that, audiences will show up for realistic plays. American naturalism is like an entire thing. So already kind of positioning Cass inside of a practice that's like slightly less of a sure bet. If not that anything in theater is a sure bet, but already, like there was a way in which I was interested in the tension between what she wants to make and what she's galvanized by, and perhaps, what there is space for a larger industry to receive. But to answer your question in a way which is about the reflection of form inside of the book, what I ultimately sort of wanted to do was have her be able to tell her story. It comes back to intimacy, right? In kind of a really like simple, direct, elegant, forward moving way, but create a structure that then can break. And I won't give any spoilers about the sort of the when or the why, but there's a moment in which the structure of the book breaks, and there's actually a play with inside the book, or actually a play inside the book. And that's, in a way, it's an absurdist moment because it's a shifting of form, but also the play has a lot of context in terms of what it is and why it's happening. So for an audience, we don't necessarily feel, or I would hope we don't feel isolated or alienated from our understanding of what the book was prior to the play,
No, it's that again, without giving anything away, I will just praise you for how well you melded that into the narrative, because it's perfectly done. So, well done. So, although it's just striking me now as we talk about absurdism, how much LA comes off as I don't want to say absurdist world, but a fantasy world in a way that New York still in the novel, New York and the other location you choose seem more grounded and real. Mm-hmm. And my LA experiences are scant. I generally only have been when I have trade shows for my day job out in San Diego. And so I'll go to LA for 2 or 3 days before that and just record podcasts from beginning to end, and then go down to San Diego for like a biotech conference. So everything is absurd and surreal to me at that point anyway. But do you notice that in terms of how, what your experience with LA, I guess, that sense of heightened fantasy, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, it's really, sort of your noticing of that feels very keen to me, because I think it's grounded in the fact that I started writing We Play Ourselves essentially the first week that I moved to LA for a TV job. And I had, prior to moving to LA for that, 5 or 6 month stretch, I had been in and out for TV meetings and that kind of a thing, but I'd never really spent any extended time there. So, my first real impressions of a constant day-to-day living in LA felt really odd and fantastical. Yeah. And I don't even mean, in sort of larger thematic ways, or like, the film industry or whatever, any of that stuff. I mean, literally, like, I would leave my Airbnb and I would be walking down the sidewalk and see plants that I had never in my life seen before and couldn't imagine. I honestly, like, there were places where I felt like I was in Jurassic Park. There were these incredible, like, armored, I don't know what they were, but armored plants that were sort of breaking into these crazy blossoms at the top. And like, there were birds that were making noise. Like, there was a bird that lived outside my Airbnb that for 3 months, I just thought that a car alarm kept going off all night for hours. And I couldn't figure it out because there were no cars parked in that particular area. And I finally realized it was a northern male mockingbird or something. But so even just the daily facts of the plant life, the animal life, the way that the city was constructed, the way that the light looks, which is so different from New York. I mean, it felt to me in some ways wholly surreal. And the book, writing the book or beginning it in that first sort of stretch of time, that sense of surreality, I think, really infused it. Because, now when I go back to LA for a gig or I'm there for a while, I don't feel that anymore. I kind of can't plug into that surreality in the same way, because now it feels like a place that I know fairly well and I really like,
Yes, I prefer keeping the unrealness of anywhere that I visit, but LA in particular. It reminds me of Steve Martin's LA Story, where, once you hit a certain hour when you're on the freeway, everybody's guns start coming out because, it's, did you see LA Story? Am I citing this one, or am I dating myself?
No, but listen, I'm writing it down as we speak.
Oh, God. I don't even know what streaming service it's on. It's in that nether zone of the 90s movie releases, things that,
Oh, sure.
they're not old enough to be, on Criterion or TCM, but, they're not hip enough to be anywhere else. Sarah Jessica Parker's first significant role, and a wonderful Richard E. Grant moment. And I'm a huge mark for him. So that's, anyway, me and my little sideline stuff. But yeah, it's a Prospero Tempest thing with LA. Steve Martin at his artsiest, but it still works as opposed to going artsy and going off the deep end. But
cool. I mean, but
not like
your description of the traffic already was resonating. I was like, oh
yeah.
That's sad in that traffic, like going east to west, for a pitch meeting. You're like, well, that's 3 hours on the highway sitting.
Yeah, it's a entertaining flick. So yeah, if you can find it, I think I found it on DVD. I'm the only guy who keeps a DVD account with Netflix. So I just get the discs in. I rip those and keep this Drobo filled with, gigantic amounts of movies that I'll never get around to watching. But, it's insurance against streaming or the internet finally going down someday. At least I'll have entertainment while the rest of the world falls into Mad Max territory.
Right.
So you mentioned theater friends reading the book. Do you get people wondering if this is them based on certain characters?
Yeah.
Are there?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I had a lot of anxiety about that. Because
I'm sure.
Actually, I had not meant to write a book about the theater. I had started writing a book about something else entirely. And when I sat down to write, I just kept writing what became We Play Ourselves. I kept writing about the theater. And eventually I sort of called my editor and I said, I think I'm writing a completely different book and I hope that's okay. But then in writing that completely other book, for a long time, it just felt like a very sort of private, intimate, quiet thing that I was doing that I wasn't thinking ahead to it being read by anybody else. But then when I got to the point of time where it was about to come out, I really started getting worried because I thought, God, I mean, theater is such a tight-knit community. Like I have such an artistic family there. And everybody always assumes books are about them, even if they're not, and even if they're not about tight-knit communities. So like, what if people read this and they think it's them and it's not, and that could be terrible. And I had all of this angst about it. And the thing that I really didn't expect was that people, of course, when theater people started reading it, people started calling and texting, and they would say like, oh, I think I know who this person is or that person is, but everyone pitched different people. There was, I don't think I heard the same name twice. And then the next iteration, which I really didn't expect, was people started calling me and self-identifying and being like, oh, I'm definitely Tara Jean Slater, or like I'm 100%. And I was like, okay, like sure.
If that's how you see yourself, that's great. But
go for it, But I think in a way, in part, perhaps because in a really unexpected turn of events, this, it has been a year where the theaters, institutions are closed. There's not any live programming. I think people have been really hungry in my community to have an engagement with theater. So there was perhaps like a real space of like playfulness and pleasure in which they could meet that book,
What's the first play, not your own, that you would want to see when it's safe to be in a theater with people again?
Probably something that's being written right now.
Yeah. And the first play of yours that you'd want to see produced when it's safe?
Oh, well, I don't.
Is that the Sophie's Choice sort of thing? I never know.
It's hard to think of. I did a play right before, in what was it, summer 2019? I did a play.
Or 5 years ago, because it's impossible to tell anymore.
Oh, yeah. It feels like in that other lifetime, in the previous world, I did a play called Witch at the Geffen, which I really sort of enjoyed doing. And we had begun conversations with a couple of theaters, with a theater in particular, about it coming to New York. And then, of course, the pandemic derailed everything. So, I would love to get a chance to work on Witch again. But what I'm interested in now, which was not the case before all of this, is that play, it's an engagement with a Jacobean play called The Witch of Edmonton, but sort of I use that play as a jumping off board, and it becomes sort of a very contemporary conversation about hope and despair, and like, can you is it possible to create change without destroying the systems that came before? Can you create change from inside the existing systems, or are those systems simply so calcified that they're unable to change? Like, that's one of the key questions of the play. And I feel like it would be an entirely different thing now with a group of collaborators to come back together around that question at this particular point, you know?
I could give you some insight about that from my day job as a lobbyist for a weird part of the pharmaceutical industry, but we'll talk about that off mic at some point.
Yes, please.
I've only done this for a couple of years, and I have, reading an essay of yours about writing, I'm in the same boat in terms of the, I'm not qualified to do anything that I'm doing, sort of approach to a lot of these jobs. But I've learned a lot in a couple of years of exposure to Washington, how legislation gets done and what people's actual motives are. It's worse than you think. But anyway, we'll talk about it. If I end up in a future play of yours, paraphrase, I'll be proud.
I'll let you know ahead of time.
Yeah. But, and this sounds weird, but again, keeping in mind, like I mentioned, I grew up, outside New York. So to me, theater always equated with Broadway. Now, this is from the 70s onwards. Like any ads we saw for theater were ads for Broadway productions or off-Broadway things that were, the next tier, basically. What did it take for you to approach theater in a way that wasn't, like that? Did you have that sort of mentality growing up in terms of what theater meant? Or, was I just, uniquely, weirdly, geographically hidebound in those terms?
I don't know that you were uniquely, weirdly hidebound, because I think that is, or for a long time was, I think is changing the past 10 years maybe, but really was the perception outside the theater community of what theater is. But oddly, I didn't come to it with any of that. I mean, both of my parents are scientists, so I didn't grow up going to the theater. I sort of stumbled into theater by accident in undergrad, where I started studying playwriting. And the angle into playwriting was, like Sarah Kane, who, talk about non-naturalist, playwriting. She's this like British provocateur. Carol Churchill, like Ntozake Shange, like all of these people who, maybe now it's different, but at the time, with Sarah Kane's, one of her first plays at the Royal Court, the people were just getting up and walking out of that small theater en masse. That wasn't a Broadway play, but that kind of theater making to me became a real example of what you can do with the form, the ways in which you can create and subvert structures, the ways you can really talk about what is at the heart of a society, politically, culturally, spiritually, and do it in sort of surprising and unusual ways. So particularly when I started engaging with American theater, I was looking at Young Jean Lee, I was looking at Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, I was looking at David Adjemi. These people, Sarah Ruhl's another one, people who were making plays that were, experimental is such a loaded word, but there was a real sort of sense of invention and reinvention and discovery and pushing the limits of the form. And that was what I fell in love with. That was what I wanted to do. And so for a long time, Broadway seemed to me like, another thing that's happening. And like, sometimes my friends make it there and that's great, but like, that's not really the point. And because that's not where the work was happening that I found particularly interesting. And I will say within the past several years, that's really started to change. Like I've started to see work on Broadway by, again, I'm not sure if this is the right word, but I would say like experimental playwrights or playwrights who really experiment with their craft. And that work is some of the most interesting work I've seen, in that geographical space. So I think it means something now to me that it didn't before in terms of what I am seeing be possible there. But as the kind of catch-all for what theater is or the be-all end-all in terms of a goal, I still don't really see it that way.
Cool. Yeah. And again, I never know what another human being is thinking. So, I get that, yeah, maybe to most people.
Super fair question. And Broadway itself is actually such an interesting, sort of inflection point also in terms of what it has been, what it is, what it might be next,
Yeah. My only visits in recent years were to see a revival of Arcadia by Tom Stoppard and Springsteen doing his performance theater thing, which is not exactly experimental theater by any means. But.
Oh, sure. And experimental is a complicated word, but Lucas Makes a Dollhouse or Hades Town or like these things that, I found really exciting, and seeing them, Taylor, Matt, Gary, seeing that on Broadway, I thought, oh, this is a different Broadway,
Yeah, I got to start getting back once I can make that trip, those 25 miles from my house into New York. My wife has been on this too. She's like, yeah, we should have been going into the city more to do stuff like this, Gil. So, yeah, I'll have to, change my life post-pandemic, provided, it's still there.
I have a whole list of life changes post-pandemic, but the truth is, once the world, if the world sort of returns to a normalcy that we recognize, probably we'll all get sucked back into the bullshit that we were sucked into prior. So
it's a really interesting question. I mean, just in my professional life, there are things that industries are learning now that they're just like the working from home thing. People are like, I didn't really need to go into the office. I was managing everything just fine by Zoom, it turns out. And, so there will be, I think, some stuff that the pendulum won't swing all the way back. But without getting too personal, tell me about your life changes or what you're hoping to affect.
Well, listen, this might be, the product of
nobody's listening. It's okay.
It's just us. But this might be the product of a lot of isolation. But, I tend to be pretty much an introvert. I like time to myself. I like being alone. I like, I love seeing my friends. I like social events, but it usually takes me a lot to sort of commit to any. And over the course of this pandemic, I started being like, oh, wow, like in my new post-pandemic life, I'm going to, make all of these plans and go see all these things, go do all these things. Like I tend to travel a lot and I miss that. So, I've been thinking about all of these different cities in which I had some work set up, or I was going to do some work, or I needed to do some research, like, that kind of thing, where in the time prior to the pandemic, I was usually so, exhausted, and I had been in like 4 different cities within 5 weeks, and I just wanted to stay home and be by myself. And, now I've had a lot of that.
Yeah. I did a podcast with Amor Tolls, the guy who wrote A Gentleman in Moscow.
Yes.
We did either 5 years ago or 2019. Again, I'm pretty sure it was 2019. And he talked about the book tour. And A Gentleman in Moscow was very successful. He did a lot of book touring, but like he came up with things to do in each city or town he was in. Like he had to go out, X number of hours before he was going to do his reading and signing. He had to get at least one picture of something, he'd never seen before. He had this whole, thing built so that he would be able to get something out of those experiences going from place to place to place. Now, with all the day job travel I'd had in my pre-pandemic life, I've literally sat on an airplane on a runway and thought, I'm not sure where I'm going. I'm like, I could look at my ticket and I know I'll find out when we land.
Right.
But I kind of forgot right now here in Newark where this plane is going to go.
Right.
Yeah, we take a lot of that for granted. And now, the world is our living rooms.
Literally. Yeah. Difference
between opening night and seeing your book on a shelf.
Ooh.
Does opening night mean what, we outside theater would think it means, or does it become blasé also over time? But
no, it means probably exactly what you think it is. And similarly to the book kind of being out in the world, opening night is, we have, previews before then, but there's still a sense of the bubble a little bit, like audiences and previews are coming into a thing that you're still working on and they know that. And so there's still a sense of, a preserved little bubble of safety, and opening night is sort of when it goes off into the world and it becomes its thing, which is sort of what's happening with the book. I don't know. I guess the only difference really is that with opening night, usually with a premiere anyway, you're there to see whether the audience likes it or not, and with a book, you are not there for those reactions, which is probably a better thing.
Which raises the next question: are reviews easier or tougher to handle in this form versus theater? or do you avoid reviews at this point?
I don't. You know, I used to. I've gone back and forth. With theater, I've
Yeah.
gone back and forth where I used to read everything and then I read nothing. And where I sort of came to with theater is that there's a sort of a handful of theater critics that I really am interested in the opinions of. I think they're really smart, they're nuanced, they're complex. Um, they don't always say good things about me, but I'm always interested in what they have to say. So I will read, and there's maybe like five of those people, four or five. So I will read their reviews of my work, of other people's work. And otherwise, I sort of don't engage with reviews because I think it's useful to an extent. And similarly with the book, I mean, again, like this is my debut novel, right? So I'm in the middle of a real learning curve. And I thought that for this process, I don't know what it will be for future ones, but for this process, I was pretty interested to just see how people were responding and what they were saying. And, you know, yeah, like what that whole conversation was.
Let's say professional reviewers versus, audience review. Or I'm not. When you mention reading reviews, are you thinking more the paid reviewers versus the mass of readers?
Yeah, generally.
Yeah.
Generally, because I also, as with theater in a way, it feels like it's not ever going to be helpful to try to take in everybody's opinion. So with theater, I found, like I said, I found places where the distillation of opinion feels helpful to me. Even if I disagree, I'm like, okay, well, that's a very strong argument for your point, even though I don't agree with it. And similarly with the book, I've been looking for places of where opinion is distilled. As opposed to like I haven't done the thing where you like go to Amazon and scroll through all the reviews. I sort of feel like everybody's entitled to their opinion, but I'm not sure how helpful it is to me to know the opinion in that way, but
yeah, 1 star because this book was printed on the wrong paper. Those sorts of things, when you see some of the reviews and what passes for audience engagement. One of the things that's interesting, or I found interesting and We Play Ourselves, was there's a bad review that occurs at one point in the novel, but not an evil reviewer, which I found a relief. I was afraid it would somehow turn into like Birdman, where there's an angry reviewer at the center of it all who is going to sink something regardless of whether it's good or not. You do go into the the power dynamic, I guess, of what the reviewers are and what they represent and how much weight is attached to certain reviews, like the New York Times. In your experience, is there a Birdman sort of character where there's a big reviewer who just has it in for certain directors or performers? Or do you just find it, that sort of thing can be an exaggeration? It's really, a case by case thing. Without naming any reviewers you hate, but
no. I think there's two parts to that question in a way. One is
at a minimum.
At a minimum,
sorry, go
500, but at a minimum too. And the first is that the thing that the book points to, and that I'm very aware of, is that part of the problem is not any individual reviewer having an opinion. Part of the problem is that American theater is structured in such a way, at least at the moment, that there is only one critical voice to which direct economic impact is attached. That a New York Times review on a play will determine whether the play gains or loses thousands and thousands of dollars in ticket sales. So that is not necessarily the reviewer's fault, nor does it mean that every review needs to be a good review, even if a reviewer doesn't like a play. But it is a deep flaw in the system, and it's something that I think systematically really needs to be addressed. The other part of that question, I have witnessed a particular situation, and this was some years ago, in which a reviewer really had it in for a set of playwrights. I luckily was not one of them, but it was work that was really good work. It was really like complex, keen, thoughtful, provoking work. And the reviewer, I mean, there was a sort of an outcry in the theater community because in one of the reviews, that particular reviewer said, yeah, I always hate this person's work, but I've showed up to review it anyway, and then proceeded to pan it. And there was a little bit of a sense of like, well, but then why? Like, actually, at that point, really, what are you trying to accomplish? Because there isn't like a review, again, doesn't need to be, you know, praise of the thing that the reviewer didn't respond to, but there should be some sense of responsibility in terms of what is the artistic conversation at hand. Where did I connect to it? Where did I not? What do I think it needs? Like there should be a reason for the review to exist. And if you actually know that you just don't find anything worthwhile about somebody's work, then you're not the person to engage with it, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah.
For me, it's even like that with guests. Like I get pitched certain books and I'm like, yeah, this is just not something. And not that, you know, I would be negative, but I'm like, this just isn't my wheelhouse. I wouldn't be able to make a good conversation with this person that, you know, effectively discusses the work, et cetera. But
Right.
I will also point out on the side, I'm a longtime basketball fan, and there was an NBA ref who could no longer be assigned to certain games because he had a propensity for throwing out the coach of this one particular team.
Oh,
They would always he would always end up ejecting this coach. And there was a point that like, we can't have this guy ref any more games with this team because something terrible will happen. He will end up throwing people out. So,
right.
yeah. But they're also in a union, so you can't fire anyone. So they had to kind of pretend it wasn't happening for a while before they had to admit that, yeah, we just can't put Steve on these games.
Right. Like maybe Steve needs a vacation.
Yeah. So to get all meta, which, you know, it's just us, to quote one of your characters, I want to ask, do you sometimes feel like you're a version of yourself?
Sure. I mean,
how much do you feel like you're performing in any given moment, including this moment? Because I'm some guy you've never met. So.
I mean, the answer, of course, is yes. I think that we all perform versions of ourselves, perhaps sometimes even without realizing that they're performances, but and sometimes we very keenly are aware that we're performing something, but that sort of every situation that you're in, there's a certain set of things that are appropriate. There's a set of things that aren't. There's a way in which, I mean, even performing professionality, like you are choosing, to leave a certain part of yourself at the door by necessity. But I think I'm very interested in like those questions of self and performance and authenticity and inhabiting in part. I mean, earlier you mentioned sort of my childhood growing up in a lot of places, but from the earliest ages, I think I was very keenly aware that when you switch languages, in a sense, you switch skins, because certain languages, every language has sort of built within it, like the blueprint for the values of the culture, the way in which thought happens, the things that are privileged in terms of thinking. And by using another language, you change, like you sort of like the DNA of your thoughts changes. And so that kind of, I don't even know if I'd call it performance, but like that kind of shape shifting initially, of course, the way that I grew up. So it wasn't something I thought too much about or even questioned that much. But then as I grew older and when I came back to the States for high school and became very aware that there was a kind of Americanness that was accepted and a kind of foreignness that wasn't, I mean, performance became much more of an active choice. In terms of, okay, what are the behaviors around me that American high school students are engaging in, and what are the ways in which I need to shift my behavior to match that so that I don't stand out?
Trust me, my life has been protective coloration.
Right. That's a very good, yes, protective coloration is a good phrase.
Well, I alternate between that and the days that I feel like I would fail a Turing test. Like if somebody was texting with me back and forth, they might reach a point where they think, is this actually a robot or a human being? I'm not 100% sure. And those aren't the great days, but we do the things we can to blend in, I guess.
To a point, and then you just get too tired to do it anymore. And I guess that's what being an adult is. But
yeah, I will say with the language thing, I'm supposed to record with an author from Finland in the next week or so. And they tell me she has great English, but I believe that no one from Finland actually can really think the way we do because their language is so absolutely different than the Proto-Indo-European language set. So I'm kind of interested in seeing how this conversation is going to work out because I'm convinced that they actually speak the language of birds and not people. But
as somebody who lived in Finland as a kid for a time, that language is unbelievably beautiful. And it was one of the languages, my parents sort of had not a rule, but a guideline that if you move to another country for a time, it's only sort of, I don't know, like it's only right, it's only courteous that you learn that language as opposed to expecting people to speak your language. And so, my parents learned some Italian, they learned some Japanese, they spoke really good French, they learned German. I mean, there was a way in which we'd go to all these different countries and they would, even just if it was only the basics, they would be operating in that language as much as they could. And Finland was the only place that completely defeated us as a family.
Well, you're lucky you never went to Hungary either. It's the same language group, the Finno-Ugric. I spent a week in Budapest, and I'm okay with etymologies and languages. I don't speak anything else, but I can at least pick up written word. I can start breaking things down. Nothing. 7 days there, I got 5 words total. It's incredible. And I looked it up, and yes, Finland is the same language root. It's those two plus a little area in the Ural Mountains. How it spread like that, nobody's quite sure, but yeah, it's the incomprehensible people. So I'm really looking forward to that podcast. That should be
that's gonna be great. That's so cool. But I will, at least, again, this was my childhood experience, but I was amazed because I was struggling so much with Finnish. I was amazed that everyone around me, including complete strangers in the grocery store, spoke a crisp, excellent English that was probably better than my English. So both an incomprehensible to me language and also something, a version of my language that I had to go to college to learn how to speak.
It's as though they lapped you. It's like, not only we're going to do our own language, we're going to do yours better than you too. There's actually a novel called Metropole by a Hungarian author named Karinthi, where basically a scientist, he falls asleep on a flight when he's headed to a conference, wakes up in the wrong city, getting back to that theme of not knowing where you're going. And when he gets there, he can't understand anything or anyone, doesn't know where he is, and he spends his whole time sort of puzzling out this city that he's living in while he's completely incapable of communicating with anyone. And I read it before I went to Budapest. And when I got back, I thought that was just a metaphor for what they go through on a daily basis. Like deep down, they don't really know what any of us are saying because Hungarian is so absolutely bizarre compared to English that they're sort of faking it and trying to get by. But, when they're out of their own language zone, they're on their own. But again, that's just me rambling on.
I'm excited to read that though.
Yeah, I'll zap you a link about that one too. So you got LA Story and Metropole, and tell me what you're reading.
Oh man.
Which I should have warned you was going to come at some point because everybody hates drawing a blank on that one. But
no, I mean, there's a whole stack of books I've been working through. I just finished Tori Peters' excellent Detransition Baby,
which I only heard about a few weeks ago, and then I saw you were doing an event with her. Gosh, I think a couple of days ago.
Yeah,
right?
A couple of days ago. Yeah, the book is excellent. That's all I'll say about it. It's excellent. Cool. Go read it. It's amazing. Before that, the other thing that I've been reading sort of obsessively and inexplicably are Hemingway's letters. Like, there's this whole set of 3 sets of volumes, I guess, of his letters, which I've been working through, which is very different from Detransition Baby. And I read Ted Chiang's book, Exhalation, the story collection. It's sort of all over the map. I just finished reading Lauren Groff's Florida. I've just been sort of without any rhyme or reason, but just following like my obsessions, which suddenly take over. Has
your reading practice or habit changed in the past year, given that you're locked down like the rest of us? Do you find you're reading different things or, otherwise changing the way you normally approach literature?
Not really. I mean, I have more time to read, sort of, but even, in the normal things, I was always reading on the subway, which took up a lot. The subway always took up hours of my life, so it was a place to read. But I guess, even though all the things I just mentioned in your books, I've been over the past year reading way more plays than I had recently. I normally just, because I would go to the theater, but it's been kind of great to get back to like seeing theater on the page. I've been reading like Deepika Guha, Antoinette Nwandu, Basil Kremendal, Brandon Jacob Jenkins. I was rereading some of his plays and just sort of spending time with like what it is like to imagine for the theater on a page.
I was wondering, I was just going to ask you, like, what do you, and it's a terrible thing. What does your consciousness do when you're reading a play? Which I know is an impossible question, but what do you see?
Initially, that's those are two different questions. What my consciousness does. Initially, I just felt really sad all the time. But then the more plays I read, I started to like actually be able to engage with the art form as an art form that I love, as opposed to like an absence that I'm living around currently. But in terms of what I see, I mean, with the plays that I know, some of the pleasure, or that I've, I know from production, some of the pleasure is seeing um, sort of exactly the playwright's particular I don't know how to say, like the way that they code a scene, the hieroglyphics of a scene, the way that they are on the page coding what they imagine, and then in my mind holding that against what I witnessed, or not against, but like up to what I witnessed, and seeing the places where the play and the production sort of intertwined, and the places where like a different set of choices was tried out. And with the plays that I had never seen in production, I mean, I imagine them in the same part of my brain that reads a book and imagines the world of the book. Like it doesn't feel, I don't, have a proscenium theater in my mind in which all these plays are playing out.
Yeah. It's also a question. Do you read a play before attending it? If it's something where there's a possibility that you're going to see it?
No, but not as a rule.
Yeah, I have no idea if that's a thing or not. So.
Some people might. I think some people, like particularly critics, will, or some people will. But generally, like you're friends with a lot of people who then have plays happening. So maybe you read an early draft of somebody's play for them, or you guys did a reading together, or you went to their reading, or like you bought each other dinner and asked for notes. Like there's a way in which like a lot of the plays that I see that are by friends of mine, we engaged with each other around that work in some way, but I wouldn't necessarily read it before I see it to sort of, I don't know. Yeah, like sometimes I'll read it after I see it because I'm curious about a particular aspect. But no, I like to go into productions just like a blank slate as much as possible. Like I also won't really read any reviews of other people's plays before I go in. Sometimes afterward I will. But I usually just want to experience whatever the hell it is and then think about it afterward.
Cool. Yeah, I was wondering. I figured that would be the case, but I just as easily figured you might say, "No, you idiot! You have to do this, this, and this," because the common denominator is I'm an idiot. But did you? Deep down, I am. But when you mentioned some of the especially the female playwrights who were your inspirations or influences when you were coming up, have you interacted with any of them? Those who are still alive?
Yeah.
Have you met your heroes, I guess?
Some of them. And sometimes like some of my teachers have become my heroes. Like I got to study with them and I really was influenced by them. I mean, again, the thing that's so, I don't know, beautiful about it in a way, as with any arts community, is like theater is such a small community. So, you really do, you people become real people to each other, like you really get to witness somebody's work, but also, I mean, Paula Vogel is an example of like, she has this whole body of work, but also she's a teacher who has had such an impact on generations and generations of playwrights, like I studied with her for a semester in college, but I've also studied with playwrights who studied with her. So there's a way in which like really like lineages get created inside the theater.
I ask because I'm wondering, sort of that well, as a white straight male guy, anything I ask along these lines is always going to be in the privileged sort of zone. But that sense of a zero sum of opportunities for women, for queer artists, for people of color, how much has that changed? Just within the span of your career in theater, and how much of it, as you work within those lineages, as you meet more people from the past, how much of a sense is there that, holy crap, it was so much worse, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or whenever, how much does that matter to you, or how much do you observe of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, It's so complicated. It's sort of like, how many hours do you have to discuss this?
No, we're getting to it kind of late in the conversation, which is a sign that I feel more comfortable asking it, because it was one of those things early on. I was like, I really want to know, but I don't want to put her in a weird spot or sound like I'm, that idiot.
What can I say about this? It's not too granular, because I also don't want to be like wildly boring to people who are not embedded in the theater. But here is the complexity. Here's the thing that I have come up against. I've witnessed my peers and friends come up against, and definitely, yes, used to be worse, is the sense of, if you are a theater and you are programming a season of plays in a country where there is no governmental funding or minimal governmental funding, your theater will be able to stay afloat and stay running and keep programming only if you are programming things that are economically viable and people are buying tickets and people are coming. So immediately, any programmatic decisions are being made by people who are frightened that making the wrong decision will send their theater out of business. And I am being, both about this and what I say next, I'm being quite reductive, but there, there is a larger, more detailed conversation to have, but this reductive version, there is getting at something very specific, which is, so in making these programmatic decisions, the ideas of economic viability are, of course, and particularly, in the history that has come before me, but also the history that I've witnessed, they're influenced by, embedded systematic racism, misogyny, homophobia. The idea of what is viable is tied to the idea of what is universal. And for the longest time, the idea of what was universal was a story about straight white men, family values, men struggling to do things. And there are really good plays that have come out of that. So I actually don't really belong to the idea that like there's no more room for Shakespeare, that we shouldn't be doing Tennessee Williams or any of that stuff. There are a lot of those plays have had a huge impact on me, but I think what I have witnessed and what has in many ways weakened the art form is this programmatic idea that, okay, if you have 6 slots, well, in order to keep the theater open, 5 slots need to be, or 4, at least 4, possibly 5 slots need to be for universal plays. So we have a slot that could be a woman's slot. It could be a slot for a writer of color. Usually there's not a queer slot. There's a way of that is so reductive. And of course, then you're like, well, what if you were a female writer of color? There's ways in which all of a sudden it's like, well, when you start to get that, reductive about the programming of a play, it gets pretty ugly actually. But what that has resulted in, of course, for a long time, was the fact that there was one slot open to anyone who wasn't a straight white man. And a lot of work that is deeply, deeply of value, meaningful work, has not been programmed. I am witnessing what looks and feels like that changing. And of course, who knows what's going to come out of this past year. But even prior, 2018, 2019, theaters were really being pressured to make different programmatic decisions. And also, I should say, a lot of the leadership of these theaters was white, was male, was predominantly white and male. And so there's also been a real movement in the theater community for there to be a diversification of leadership. I don't know what's going to come out of it, but yes, I feel like I am watching the sea changes happen. And I also have really witnessed what the status quo has looked like before these sea changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I figured your career has been long enough to know what the bad times look like, but
Yeah, but honestly, like hearing, and I think I can say this because they've talked very openly about it in interviews as well, hearing Marcia Norman or Teresa Rebeck, talk about their experience of the American theater, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, I feel very lucky that has not been my experience. So, there has been a slow and steady trend, out of misogyny, racism, and homophobia, but we're not there yet, for sure.
First generation American Jew. I know the stories from just a couple of generations before mine too. Things that now seem, assimilated and normal, we realize did not, they haven't always been. And that a lot of things take time. But with We Play Ourselves, do you Do you see more novels in your future?
Oh, yeah.
Is this a form that you enjoyed enough to continue?
Yes, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
And we didn't get into the Fight Club angle of the book, but because there's a whole lot that we could talk about, but that it's one of the things I hate with talking about novels with people is talking too much about what's in them. But all of that said, there is a Fight Club angle of the book, which raises the question: have you ever been in a fight?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
But probably not the way that you're imagining it. When I was much younger, I trained martial arts.
Oh, no shit.
And
Cool.
so there, yes, there we were there were constantly fights that I was in, but I would call them matches more than fights.
Yeah, controlled situations as
Not
opposed
a bar
to.
fight. I've never been in a bar fight. I'm not.
I do have.
But
I have British, northern British family members who have filled me in on what to do in a bar fight, especially if there's a pool table. Do not go for the pool cue. Grab a couple of the balls on the pool table, get under the table, take your shoe off, take your sock off, stuff the balls into the sock, and then just start whirling that around, and you will be able to get out of the pool fight or the bar fight as quick as you can. That is the best weapon to develop, it turns out. So.
I'm going to save that advice for later because I feel certain that it will come in handy at some point.
Oh, I've got lots of great stuff too. I also have the one piece of travel advice that, again, none of us can use now, but from all the years of business travel I had, I developed the single rule of thumb. Always treat everything in your hotel room as though a lonely traveler has used it for some horrible, deviant sexual purpose. Just go into a room with that assumption. Don't touch the remote control, the coffee maker, or any doorknobs, really. Just start with that, and you might be able to get through this, get through that hotel stay a little more sane, I guess.
I think we're all going to come out of the pandemic with that as sort of a rule of thumb. Because
You'd think.
I was talking to a friend this morning, and he was like, sometimes I just imagine the world in which I got on the New York subway. I held the pole as I stood there. I wiped my face. I brushed my eye itched. I rubbed my eye. I held the pole some more. I got off the subway. I bought a bagel. I held it in my hand. I ate it. He was like, I was imagining what my day-to-day looked like, and it is from another planet.
Yeah. I will say, even before all this, unless it was summer, now I would often drive into New York, park on West 96th Street at my favorite garage, and go up to 95th and take the 1 or the 2 or 3. I would always wear gloves. It'd be very stylish gloves, but I'd always wear gloves on the subway.
You were prepared.
It's just one of those things. I'm not a horrendous germphobe, but it was a New York City subway, which raises the question: have you? Well, I don't even know. Are you in the city or are you in California? Where are you physically now?
In the city. I've been in.
Have you taken the subway?
No, not yet.
I have friends who did late spring, early summer. And I was like, I literally can't imagine doing that, especially back then. But, even now I couldn't conceive of doing it. But
yeah, I have friends who have also. And I think, if I need, I've been really lucky in that all of my work has been from home right now. So I think if I needed to, I would just have to figure it out and do it. But,
yeah.
But right now I'm waiting, particularly with all these variants, and we don't need to go down the COVID rabbit hole, but I'm just sort of trying to.
No, that's my day job.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
I will have some interesting stories when we're off mic, but nothing we need to share with the audience. I guess as a weird last question, within We Play Ourselves, there is a desire for fame and recognition. Like for Cass, she wants to be recognized or validated for her art. But, some of the people she meets, they sort of characterize our time. They just want to be famous for anything. They want, fame in and of itself. So the question I really struck me was, who's more fame whorish, New Yorkers or Angelenos? Because it really comes off as Angelenos again. But, in your experience,
I don't know that it's a city thing. What strikes me so much is the way that and fame is a distillation of it, but the way that our culture has evolved such that if we're not being witnessed, we feel like we don't exist, right? And of course, there's the whole social media conversation is a conversation, but that this desire for fame is really just the desire to be witnessed to such a degree that you have to feel like you exist. And I think for Cass in particular, her desire for success is tied into this, like, I don't know, this fear of being unwitnessed, this fear of being alone, this fear of like, well, what did I spend my whole life doing if nobody saw me do it? You know, whereas somebody like Carolyn, who is a documentary filmmaker in the book, she has a real ambition built around access and what she wants access to and how she wants to be seen by other people. You know, I'm interested not in the monolith of, you know, Americans want to be famous or what does that fame look like, but rather the hunger that underlies the need to be seen. And I think some of my interest in that comes from the fact that I find it very uncomfortable to be seen. Like, I'm really happy when I am completely invisible and just doing my work. And it requires a lot from me to sort of be at the front of the room, I guess. So I'm really riveted by people who thrive in those environments or who long for them, you know.
Yeah, how tough was it for you to write that? To write in that mode? How tough was it for you to grasp that, I suppose, in terms of being able to reflect it?
It felt sort of mesmerizing and a little bit liberating, like to write a character who so unapologetically longs for success or for visibility. I mean, it was a different way of thinking, and it was kind of delicious. But I'm glad that I don't live in that mode, because I also think that you make yourself so vulnerable to the outside world when you do that, you know? And it's easy to lose track, I think, of what you're actually trying to do if you're constantly waiting to see how other people are perceiving what you're doing.
Yeah, it was one of the more fascinating aspects of the book for me, partly because I have less and less interaction with the world, especially in the past year, that it's like, oh, this was a entree to you know, people's lives and how, again, we want to be seen and understood. Well, I'm busy sending these out every week to, you know, an invisible audience. But
well, these are, I mean, I think I told you this over email, but I've really been enjoying listening to the writers on this podcast that you talk to. And
thanks.
Podcast episode really is like a little window into somebody's world. And
I keep getting asked to do video of this, and I think, no, this is the voices. These are the voices in our head, as it were. But,
yeah. I mean,
so after this, I'm going to ask you for guest suggestions also, because that's my version of success with the podcast is just the cascade effect of people turning me on to other people I should be reading and recording with. So
I'll send you some names. There's some artists who I would love to hear their conversation with you. So selfishly, I will. Selfishly, I'll send them along to you.
That tends to work for me. You know, other people's selfishness drives. That's capitalism in a weird way, except for me, there's absolutely no money in this whatsoever, which again brings us to you and your life in the theater, I guess. I'm kidding. You know.
No, that was very accurate.
Which I feel bad about, but you talk about, especially in the book, the you know, the lack of financial reward for this whole thing.
Yeah.
Is it well, I wouldn't ask whether there are regrets or not, but, you know, do you regret not working in other forms earlier in your career? Or do you feel like, you know, getting to stories and getting to a novel when you got to them are, you know, good in your terms of development?
Yeah, I mean,
did you do this at the right time? I guess that's my roundabout thing.
Yeah. I think in terms of when I was ready to do other things, I wasn't ready until I was ready. Like, there was a way in which for a long time I had this really sort of, I don't know, like purist concentration on theater, and it was hard for me to imagine doing anything outside the theater. And I feel like I learned a lot by doing that about my craft, about my voice, about what I care about, what I have to say. And then I was ready to work in other crafts. But you know, like, it's so interesting, and particularly when I talk to, you know, younger writers or students, or when I teach workshops, people want to know, and I remember also wanting to know sort of, well, what's the path? Like, what does the path look like? And it's taken me so long to realize that and this is perhaps a very obvious statement, but that there are so many paths. And the thing that is confusing is they are all so contradictory. They look so different. There are writers who come out of an MFA in playwriting and they go straight into TV and they write 8 seasons of TV, and then they write a play again and they go back to the theater. Like there's just so many different ways to do it that like what I end up talking with students about is, well, what does your path feel like it needs to look like in order for you to feel that you are, I don't know, exercising your full potential as an artist?
You know, it reminds me of my being a failed writer, about, you know, reading those Paris Review Writers at Work interviews.
Oh, I love those.
I know, because you mentioned somewhere recently, like just getting back to a stack of old Paris reviews, like as though there was some, you know, some mechanism to be learned, as opposed to just, you know, enjoying the conversation with them. You know, when I was young, it was about, you know, oh, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, this is, again, the path. But, you know, there's no substitute for actually writing, which I eventually learned around 50. But, you know.
I mean, sure. There is that. But you know, it's interesting you mentioned the Paris Review interviews, because I do still find myself reading interviews or listening to interviews with other writers where I'm like, I'm listening for a map or a blueprint, you know, like somebody tell me how to do this. And I think all of us at a certain point, we're like, we just have to acknowledge that in whatever way we're doing it. And that, but there's still a lot to learn, I guess, from other people, of course. But I desperately want somebody to tell me how to do it. I'm still waiting for that.
I have no lessons for you. None of my guests do either. But, you know, I think you've helped contribute to the ambiguity of a path versus the path. So real last question, graphic novel about sad pandas. Is that in your future?
One has to hope. I have to hope. I will say I'm making a tarot deck of sad pandas.
Awesome.
And that has been giving me so much pleasure. Yeah, but
do you do the tarot, the creative tarot sort of thing?
Yeah. Or wait, which sort of thing do you mean? Like in terms of
I'm literally trying to say it without sounding as though I'm being deprecating or anything weird. So does tarot play into your creative life, I guess, is how I'm going to reformulate that on the fly.
Oh, sure. Yes. I mean, it plays into, I love tarot. And I use it as kind of a meditative tool, perhaps more than a creative tool, but of course a meditative mind is often creative in other ways. But when I was writing on a TV show, a number of people in the room had sort of really developed tarot practices, and I had never, I'd never done that before. I thought of tarot as like, what is that, fortune telling? Like I didn't really know, and they really got me into it. I don't know. I'm like, how deep should we go? But there's like this whole way of using the deck that isn't about asking like predictive questions of the future, but it's really about stilling your mind, calming your mind, focusing your intentions or your mind. And that has played a big part sort of in my meditative life.
It sounds like we have an awful lot more to talk about. So we should end this one with a promise of we're going to talk again, right?
That sounds great. Let's do it.
Awesome. And next time will be in person. You know, you'll have to be in New York, New Jersey, or it'll have to be one of those Gil is running to LA for, 72 hours before a biotech trip. But,
we'll make it happen. And hopefully we won't need to be wearing N95s when that happens either.
That's, to me, one of the toughest things, because my entire verbal mode is essentially Holly Hunter talking out of the side of my mouth. And with a mask on, I basically look like I'm dead. Like no one can actually tell I'm doing anything or giving any expression. So we've had to learn a lot. So anyway, Jen, this has been a blast. Thanks so much for coming on. And I will, not that you need to be told this, but I will be picking up some extra copies of We Play Ourselves to give out to a couple of friends, because I enjoyed the living hell out of your novel. So, congrats.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure to talk with
you. And that was Jen Silverman. Her new novel is We Play Ourselves from Random House. It's out now. You can find it in bookstores every damn where. It is awfully entertaining, funny, thoughtful. It really gives you a perspective on the arts and what it means to commit to a life like that. So I really hope you give it a read. Now, Jen's site, where you can learn more about her playwriting, her pre-pandemic travels, press, appearances, both of her books, We Play Ourselves and The Island Dwellers, and more. That's all at jensilverman.com, which is JenSilverman. So Jen is with one N. She's on Twitter as _Jen_Silverman, and on Instagram as, and this is calling back to the beginning of this, the intro, This Panda Is Sad, with a underscore between each word. If you search for Jen Silverman on either platform, that'll take you to each of those accounts, and they're both really good follows. And there'll be links to all this stuff in the show and episode notes. And after we wrapped, Jen and I shot the breeze for, well, way too long. I haven't talked to anyone in a week or so for non-work purposes, so we kind of gabbed for a while. But afterwards, she connected me with like half a dozen playwrights and other writers who she's close with. So I'm hoping that'll turn into some more guests for 2021. Now, you can support this podcast by telling other people about it, and by letting me know what you think, by writing me letters, emails, postcards, however you like to correspond, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which I don't check, I don't answer, but I check out the messages. That is 973-869-9659. However you reach out, tell me what you like, tell me what you don't like about the show. Tell me who you want to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or music or whatever cultural product you think I should. Cultural product? Man, what was a bullshit term like that doing in your mouth, Gil? What piece of art you think I should turn our listeners on to? That's what I mean. Not cultural products, works of art. Anyway, if you've got money to spare, I don't want it. I'm doing just fine with work. Well, as I mentioned at the top, I work in a field where I represent companies that make drugs and vaccines for other companies, so I'm kind of busy right now. But if you do have money to spare, there are a lot of people and institutions in need. You can find individuals through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, whatever. But if you want to work with institutions or foundations, my first recommendations are your local food bank and the Poor People's Campaign. There are also freedom funds and other nonprofits, other ways that you can contribute to try to help people and try to help us work towards a better world. Also, I still have some copies left of the first issue of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. If you want one, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and fill out the little form there. It's free. You can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want, but do not feel obliged. It's not about making money by any means. This is about me sharing my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.